including human beings. And we have set out to stop that movement to the greatest degree that we can. Human smugglers take thousands of dollars from truly desperate people, people overwhelmingly trying to escape a lack of economic opportunity, in many cases, rates of violence in their home country. And they send them on a course north on a network that rivals Dante's journey into hell. Along the way, these desperate people are often beaten, raped, starved, and robbed of whatever possession they've carried with them. The smugglers make few guarantees, and they offer no refunds. Special interest aliens. Not every person moving along these networks is an economic refugee or trying to escape poverty. We face real threats from so-called special interest aliens that move at great expense from vast distances from outside the Western Hemisphere along the network into the United States. The special interests, if they are from parts of the world where terrorism is prevalent, or nations that are hostile to the United States. These individuals pay TCOs, transnational criminal organizations, huge sums of money to transport them from, for example, the Middle East or Asia, through South and Central America and into the United States. We don't get to vet them, is a critical point. We don't know their intentions. We don't know why they're here and why they're coming. They slip into our country unnoticed, living among us, and we're completely blind as to what they are capable of. But the damage TCOs do in violence and potential terror is only part of the story. It is also that they move vast tonnages of marijuana and hard drugs, cocaine, heroin, counterfeit opiates, fentanyl, and methamphetamines. They move these vast tonnages across our borders to feed both the recreational and the addictive U.S. drug demand. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, U.S. Immigration, Customs Enforcement, ICE, and ICE's Homeland Security investigations, and the U.S. Coast Guard all bear witness to the massive quantity of drugs that these organizations traffic into the United States every day with devastating consequences. In 2015, which is the most recent data we have, there were over 52,000 deaths from these drugs in the United States caused by these drug overdoses. It's the highest number of drug-related deaths our country has ever seen. It's more deaths than the peak of the AIDS epidemic in 1995. It's in a single year, we've lost nearly as many Americans to drug overdoses as we lost in the entire World War I. It's almost as many as we lost in 12 years of fighting in Vietnam. And that's just overdose deaths. That number, as high as it is, says nothing about the long-term health damage to our citizens who survive. To say nothing about the human misery, the families ripped apart, and the extremes of crime and violence inherent in the illegal drug enterprise. And let me be clear about marijuana. It is a potentially dangerous gateway drug that frequently leads to the use of harder drugs. Additionally, science tells us it is not only psychologically addictive, but can have profound negative impacts on the still developing minds of teens and people up into their mid-20s. Beyond that, however, its use and possession is against federal law, and until the law is changed by the United States Congress, we in DHS, along with the rest of the federal government, are sworn to uphold all the laws that are on the books. DHS personnel will continue to investigate marijuana illegal pathways along the network into the United States, its distribution within the homeland, and will arrest those involved in the drug trade according to federal law. CBP, our customs professionals, will continue to search for marijuana at sea, air, and land ports of entry, and when found, take similar and appropriate actions. When marijuana is found at aviation checkpoints and baggage screening, TSA personnel will also take appropriate action. Finally, ICE will continue to use marijuana possession, distribution, and convictions as essential elements as they build their deportation, removal, apprehension packages for targeted operations against illegal aliens living in the United States. They have done this in the past, are doing it today, and will continue into the future. Now about terrorism. The TCOs have a devastating effect on our homeland, yet the other aspect of the threat, of course, is terrorism. For a brief moment after the 9/11 attacks, we all came together as a country and stood shoulder to shoulder against this horrible, horrible threat to our way of life. But the years have passed, we've grown somewhat accustomed to it, and now question all the security, all of the issues that we have put in place to secure the nation, because it's a little bit of an inconvenience at an airport, a little bit of an inconvenience as you pass onto an airplane. The threat to our nation, our American way of life, has not diminished. In fact, the threat has metastasized and decentralized, and the risk is threatening us today in a way that is worse than we experienced 16 years ago on 9/11. As I speak these words, the FBI has opened terrorism investigations in all of our 50 states. And since 2013, there have been 37 ISIS-linked plots to attack our country. This is all bad news, but it gets worse. Experts estimate that perhaps 10,000 citizens of Europe have joined the caliphate fight in Syria and in Iraq. Thousands more from nations in Asia, Africa, the Western Hemisphere have also joined that fight. They have learned how to make IEDs, employ drones to drop ordnance, and acquired experience on the battlefield that by all reports they are beginning to increasingly bring home. And as the coalition we lead wins against what are best described as conventional terrorist formations in the caliphate, the expectations that many of these holy warriors will survive, come back to their home countries where they will wreak murderous havoc in Europe, Asia, the Maghreb, the Caribbean, and the United States. And because many are citizens of countries in our visa waiver program countries, they can more easily travel to the United States, which makes us and continues to make us the prime terrorist target. Homegrown terrorism is a very, very difficult challenge. Few of the challenges we face from a terrorism point of view are even close to as difficult. Over the past few years, we've seen an unprecedented spike in homegrown terrorism. In the past 12 months alone, there have been 36 homegrown terrorist cases opened in 18 states. These are the cases we know about. Homegrown terrorism is notoriously difficult to predict, detect, and certainly almost impossible to control. And what's feeding the violence? Typically, what feeds the violence is the internet. From anywhere across the world, terrorist organizations are sharing hateful propaganda with impressionable people. They publish revolting how-to manuals, teaching their followers how to build bombs and kill innocent people. They trade dehumanizing pictures with grotesque captions, headless bodies, innocent people being thrown from buildings, rape, victims being stoned to death. If you're a terrorist with an innocent internet connection, like the one on your ever-present cell phone, you can recruit new soldiers, plan your attacks, and upload a video calling for jihad with just a few clicks. And thanks to new and ever-improving and proliferating encryption devices and secure communication techniques, these individuals are becoming harder and harder, and I predict eventually impossible to detect. Until community leaders, social service providers, teachers, local law enforcement, and more are more aware of their options to prevent that message of hate from taking hold, our nation's youth are prey to these predators. We are under attack from terrorism both within and outside of our borders. These men and women are without conscience, and they operate without rules. They despise the United States because we are a nation of rights, of laws, and of freedoms. They have a single mission, and that is our destruction. And I tell you without exaggeration, they tried to carry out this mission each and every day, each and every night. They are relentless. They cannot be stopped unless men and women like those that serve in DHS, our military, and our law enforcement are ever vigilant, and they are. Cyber for a minute. Not just bombs and guns are threatened against us. Another entire kind of conflict is taking place in the computer networks. We are under constant attack by a wide range of adversaries with an even wider range of capabilities in this realm. There are nation-state actors with extremely sophisticated tools. There are global criminal organizations that operate like a legitimate business right down to customer service support. There are even lone wolves, cyber terrorists that simply buy malware on the internet. Their motivations vary from military to espionage, from financial to political, and sometimes they just want to create havoc. They target our government networks, they target our critical infrastructure. Systems throughout America are being bombarded on a daily, even hourly basis. Our water treatment plants, our transportation systems, our electric grid, our financial sectors, and everything in between. These attackers steal intellectual property, personal data, and health information. They are thieves, vandals, saboteurs, enemies of democracy, and potentially much, much more. We live in an interconnected world. That's not a trend. That is, in fact, reality. We rely on technology for everything, from our coffee makers to running global corporations. But this reliance, and perhaps over-reliance, brings risks. What would happen to our country if the stock market couldn't process trades? What would happen to our transportation system if the navigation satellites suddenly went dead? What would happen if a major American city lost power? Cyber threats present a tremendous danger to our American way of life. The consequences of these digital threats are no less significant than threats from the physical world. And so every day we prepare to fight what many people can't even imagine. It's a big job, this department. We're up against criminal organizations, terrorists, cyber attacks, wannabe assassins, pandemics, hurricanes, and oil spills. The danger is real, but so is our dedication, our professionalism, and our expertise. These risks, these hazards, that's why we do what we do. 16 times in my life, I have raised my right hand and solemnly swore before my God that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Our nation is unique in that we swear our allegiance to a piece of paper, a constitution, to law, not to a king or to a president or to a party, but the supreme law of the land. Every single DHS employee has taken the same oath to the same constitution. We vow to uphold the law and to operate within it. We have a sacred duty, and that is the continuation of the United States as we know it, to protect our way of life and the exceptional people we are. Every day we take a stand against the forces that endeavor to take that exceptionalism away from us. I am proud to say that with help from our international, interagency, and private sector partners, state and local partners, we are standing strong and winning the battle. But we must win the battle 100% of the time, every day. Our adversaries only have to get one punch in occasionally to make their point. Back to talking about crime. No better argument for secure borders than the transnational criminal organizations we face. And since the first week of President Trump's administration, we have been actively securing our borders and enforcing our immigration laws. Not only is this our right as a sovereign nation, it is our responsibility to ensure the safety of the American people. People who illegally cross our borders do not respect the laws of our nation. We want to get the lawbreakers off our streets and out of our country for the good of our communities. But being serious about our borders and our laws is not just good for the American people, it will also save lives. In fiscal year 2016, Customs and Border Protection saved nearly 4,000 near-death individuals who had found themselves abandoned by the coyotes, the traffickers, in the desert and nearly died. 4,000 CBP saved. Much has been made of our efforts to discourage women from endangering themselves and their children at the hands of these human smugglers. But it's working. While more than 16,000 family units were apprehended at the border in December, only 1,100 were apprehended in March. This is a phenomenal drop in movement. And every one of them that didn't come didn't subject themselves to the dangers of the network and the abuse of that network. Fewer people are crossing the border illegally means fewer deaths in the desert, fewer people, as I say, submitting themselves to that terrible, terrible network experience. There is nothing more, and I know I speak for the Attorney General, nothing more that we would like to do than to put these human smugglers out of business. And we'll do anything, our departments, to do just that within the law. The drop in illegal immigration is really remarkable. The dramatic reduction is evident across the southwest border. In fact, March apprehensions were 30% lower than February and 64% lower than this time last year. These numbers are lower because we've shown that we're serious about border security and enforcing our immigration laws. We have ended catch and release and also focused on apprehending and prosecuting and convicting the traffickers or the coyotes themselves. We haven't done that before. We have significantly increased detainers for deportation, and we have arrested more criminal aliens. We will continue to expand our approach to include the prosecution of anyone, including family members, that pay the traffickers, especially when they pay the traffickers to move children up that terrible network. Our DHS personnel who enforce these laws, primarily ICE and CBP, know they have a job to do and are trained to do it, and are doing it humanely in accordance with the laws as passed by the United States Congress. These dedicated and selfless men and women have the knowledge, the training, and the resources, and this is a big one, they know they have an administration and a department and a secretary that have their back. While we've seen a drop in human smuggling, agencies across our department continue to seize vast amounts of dangerous drugs. At the midpoint of this fiscal year, the Coast Guard is combating a sharp uptick in cocaine flow and has already removed nearly 243,000 pounds that were headed to the United States. CVP has reported a 39% increase in cocaine seizures for a total of over 43,000 pounds. They've also seen an increase in heroin and methamphetamine seizures, and again, it's only halfway through the fiscal year. When you consider that CVP seized an average of 4 tons of drugs every single day in 2016, and that number is going up, you see our nation has a serious, serious drug problem. We need a national and a comprehensive drug demand strategy and a commitment to reduce drug demand in the United States. And I don't mean arresting our way out of this. I mean, it's a comprehensive plan to reduce drug demand. A focused effort that not only employs the full measures of the federal, state, and local governments, but also Hollywood, professional sports figures and teams, high school coaches, Boy and Girl Scout leaders, and community activists, as well as law enforcement like the FBI and DEA in their Chasing the Dragon program, as well as priests, pastors, rabbis, and imams to lead their flocks. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, it all begins at home. Parents have got to be more engaged in what their children are doing, whether it's on the internet or taking drugs, experimenting with drugs. The time is now because this president has recognized this problem, and he has signed an executive order establishing the President's Commission on Combating Drug Addiction, of which I am part. One of the things we're certainly trying to do, and I will never point fingers at the source of the immigration, but we have deterred successfully a huge amount of immigration, illegal immigration coming up from the Central American countries. But for the most part, they leave because there is no economic opportunity there for them. So we're trying to get at that issue as well. We, along with the State Department and others, are hosting a conference in Miami in the middle of June. We'll have, Mexico is helping us co-host, we'll have all 4 of the Central American countries in question attend there. The Inter-American Development Bank, Ambassador Luis Moreno is fully on board with us. We'll have European partners come in, the Canadians and the Colombians will come down, as well as Panama and Costa Rica will come in as observers. What we're going to try to do is have a conference to stimulate economic development and investment in the 3 countries, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And in that way, try to create an environment in those countries where people will stay there, where their families are, where their culture is, where their churches are, and not take that terrible trip up into the United States. They lack the economic opportunity. That's why the vast majority of them leave. And as I say, co-hosting with Mexico, we're going to try to make a difference. So we're not just trying to keep them away, we're trying to give them a reason to stay home. This conference on Central American prosperity and security is designed to help these countries in a way that we've never really attempted before. As I've mentioned a number of times in a number of hearings and whatnot, We have tried to push the borders of the United States as far away as possible. And we do this in various ways, partnering with countries like Colombia, in Mexico in particular, in the Caribbean nations, using the incredibly capable national security cutters of the United States Coast Guard that do unbelievable work in the Caribbean, in the Eastern Pacific, in interdicting loads of cocaine and other drugs by the ton, not by the gram, not by the kilo, but by the ton. We must use our relative geographic distance to our advantage. We've got to stop criminals and terrorists from threatening our homeland. We need to know who is coming into our country, where they've been, why they're coming here, before they ever arrive at our doorstep. The first step is improving our vetting processes, indeed increasing the reliability of our vetting procedures overseas. We'll use all the tools we have available, social media, new technology, biometrics, more investigators, and top-notch intelligence. Last year, DHS and our analysis folks developed 900 new intel leads. 500 of those were not previously known in the intel community. These were bad people that we identified and prevented from coming to our country. This work helped the intelligence community and DHS personnel keep people with terrorist ties out of the United States. We've operationalized intelligence. Everything we do is based on the intelligence we gain from a myriad of sources, and not just what we gain, what we develop, but intelligence provided us throughout the intel community. We have successfully, fairly successfully, been able to stop much terrorism from coming to our shores. And the same applies to what we do in the world of cyber, partnering with not only other aspects of the United States government, other agencies of the United States government, but as well as, in a big way, the commercial and even international partners to help us prevent this destructive force as well. Employee morale, as I close out my remarks, employee morale. For too long, the men and women of my department have been political pawns. They've been asked to do more with less and less and less. In many ways, similar to the treatment suffered by our law enforcement over the past few years, they are often ridiculed and insulted by public officials and frequently convicted in the court of public opinion on unfounded allegations testified to by street lawyers and street spokespersons. If lawmakers do not like the laws that we enforce, that we are charged to enforce, that we are sworn to enforce, then they should have the courage and the skill to change those laws. Otherwise, they should shut up and support the men and women on the front lines. My people, my people have been discouraged from doing their jobs for nearly a decade, disabled by pointless bureaucracy and political meddling, and suffered disrespect and contempt by public officials who have no idea what it means to serve. During my confirmation process and in hearings, members of Congress, the press, and other public officials frequently ask me about the morale problems the department has experienced over the last few years. My response has simply been, when you discourage, when you disable, when you unjustly criticize, in default to believing the initial reports as opposed to defaulting to believing the stories told by my professionals, when you do all of those things and show disrespect to the individual who's risking his or her life to defend the country, when you do those things, what do you expect? All of this stopped on January 20th. It stopped with President Trump, and it stopped with me. My people, the men and women of this department, do a difficult and at times nearly impossible job in the service of the American people. They deserve our nation's thanks and respect. They deserve to be proud of the jobs that they do. We are moving in exactly the right direction. Why? Because the best way to improve morale is to let employees do the jobs they were hired and trained to do, and recognize them for doing those jobs. We will never apologize for enforcing and upholding the laws of this country. We will never apologize for carrying out our mission. We will never apologize for making our country more secure. We ask nothing more than respect and support. We don't do this for the thank yous. We seldom get thank yous. We do this to keep America strong, secure, and free. We live in a dangerous world, ladies and gentlemen. Those dangers are increasing. not decreasing, and changing speed and direction every single day. But every day we are vigilant, every day we are prepared, every day we do our jobs. So with that, I will close and say thank you for the opportunity, GW, to come up here and make these few comments. But in particular, I want to thank the men and women, over nearly 250,000, that do the job at DHS every single day. You're all important. In my personal opinion, you're all heroic. You're all great public servants, and keep on charging. Thanks very much.
Well, since you mentioned you rarely get the thank yous, let me thank you for a phenomenal tour de force covering a whole range of issues that the department grapples with day in, day out. So thank you, Mr. Secretary. And let me also acknowledge we have a couple of your predecessors here. I see Secretary Chertoff in the front. I see Jane Lute sitting next to Judge Webster, one of my oldest mentors. We've got our newly confirmed Deputy Secretary, Elaine Duke. Congratulations. Kirsten, one of our senior fellows. So we've got a great group of people here today. So I thought I'd start with a question that cuts at the actual title of today's event, the home and away. And you had mentioned in particular discussing cyber, the interconnected risk that we face today. Can you expand a little bit upon sort of the home and away game? And obviously DHS has a very significant international role, but how do you see that coming together, especially since just before you came to the department, you're a combatant commander at U.S. Southern Command, which obviously shares a number of those risks. So how do you see the military component interact with DHS, and more generally, the risk that we're facing today?
I would just offer a story. A very, very good friend of mine, his name is Jay Johnson. And I was in Southern Command, and that particular that command is responsible for interacting with our great partners in Central America, South America, the Caribbean. And it was during the big UAC crisis, the unaccompanied child crisis, I think it was 14. Jay had just taken the job. He called me up one day and he said, and I'd been in my job at Southcom for a period of time, and he called and he said, Kel, you got to help me out here. What can you do to stop all of this illegal immigration and all of the drugs and all the rest of it that's coming up into the United States? And I said, Jay, where are you right now? And he said, well, I'm in Texas. I'm on the Rio Grande border. And I said, well, which way are you looking? And he said, well, I'm looking south. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, why don't you meet me in Guatemala on a river, and you and I can stand on that river and look north, and you will see an entirely different perspective as to the problems of drugs, violence, and illegal immigration. And to his great credit, he did that the next week, and we stood there on the river between Mexico and Guatemala. And that began a relationship that Jay and I, we tried to VTC weekly. We didn't pull it off weekly, but certainly a couple times a month. We talked almost every week on various issues, sometimes more than that. By contrast, and this gets to the military piece, by contrast, with the exception of running detention ops at Guantanamo Bay, which was my responsibility, very, very proud of that mission that I accomplished with my people, very proud of the men and women that do a great job down there every single day in Guantanamo. But with the exception of Guantanamo, in 39 months I never had a conversation with the Secretary of Defense about Southcom. But I had weekly conversations, sometimes more often than that, with the Secretary of Homeland Security. So the reality in that part of the world where there is very, very little possibility for state-on-state violence, but a huge partnering responsibility, and very, very proud to say that while I was there, my predecessor, certainly Admiral Kurt Tidd, who's there now, carries on that tradition of tremendous partnering, and Kurt Tidd and I, Admiral Tidd and I, now the commander of Southern Command, speak frequently. Again, the same relationship.
When we were in the green room prior to your remarks, we chatted very briefly about the Terror Screening Center and some of the capabilities that are being brought to there. And in your remarks, you talked about operationalizing intelligence. Could you expand a little bit in terms of how these pieces are coming together? Are we fully utilizing the capabilities that are there? And I mean, obviously, the intent is always to get there before the bomb goes off, and intelligence is the lifeblood for our campaign against terrorists or transnational criminal enterprises. So what sorts of steps do you see there from a terror travel perspective? And then speaking about our partners in Mexico, it started a little bumpy. Can you give us a sense of where that bilat is, U.S.-Mexico, right now?
Well, let me start with the Mexican relationship. I mean, Mexico, when I was in Southern Command, was not part of the Southern Command set of partners that I interacted with. However, I interacted with their military frequently, conferences, things like that. I have friends in the senior levels of the Mexican military. I knew a number of ministers within the Mexican government. So when I took this job, I made it a point to get to Mexico, Central America, then Mexico, very, very quickly to maintain the tremendous relationship that we do have. They're great partners along the southwest border with our CVP and local law enforcement. They're great partners in counterterrorism. They're great partners in working with our law enforcement and intelligence agencies, sharing information. We help them, they help us. Last year, they stopped, took into apprehended or detained and then sent back to their home countries 160,000 Central Americans before they ever got beyond 100 miles from the Guatemalan border. They're great partners, and I think that continues. I don't think there's I'm increasingly close to the new Mexican ambassador to the United States. I met him first in Mexico City when I was down there with Rex Tillerson. I don't think there's a Mexican, I hope, there's not a Mexican official that comes to Washington that doesn't drop by. I'm going to Mexico for a second visit here pretty quick. We are in good shape, in good coordination, in good partnership with the Mexican government, the Mexican military, Mexican law enforcement. And they're suffering, again, from our drug demand, and we have to recognize that. On the issue of terrorism, I'm comforted by what I now know are the capability of Department of Homeland Security. I mean, I've been around a long time and been in a fair number of fights. But I take comfort in the fact that this organization, DHS, is so effective in what it does in terms of intel sharing, taking advantage of databases, as well as producing our own intel. I would tell you that when a person of interest, that is to say someone who's on a terrorist list, buys a plane ticket in Tokyo and is flying to Abu Dhabi, we know about it. And he's not even coming here. In the information sharing with our European partners, with everybody, it's really, really comforting. And I would just close on the topic by saying, when you hear a report of a family, an individual, whatever, at an airport being put into secondary screening, or being refused entry into the United States, believe me, it's not because of the skin color. It's not because of part of the country or world they come from. It's not because of their religion. It's because someone, something, some indicator, some tipper brought the CVP professional there, and they are professionals, brought them to make a decision to put them into additional screening. It may have been something they said, their story didn't work out. It may have been something on their cell phone that brought the attention, but there's always, always, always more to the story. And I can't tell you the number of phone calls I get from members of Congress telling me about how we're refusing someone's entry at LAX or at JFK because they're Muslim or because they're Arab. It's absolutely not true. We do it for a reason, and you should applaud those men and women for doing what they do.
So you mentioned transnational criminal organizations, which I might note has been elevated in your leadership at the Department of Homeland Security, and I think rightfully so. You've mentioned terrorist organizations, both FTOs, foreign terrorist organizations, as well as homegrown extremists. and you mentioned cyber. Anything, not that that's a short list, it's a very, very, very big list, but anything that's missing on that list that keeps you up at night in terms of risks and threats? That
I would say the only thing that would keep me up at night, again, when I was at Southcom, I talked about this a lot. Oftentimes told not to talk about it, but I did anyways. This issue of the network that we have already slowed down. In 90 days, we have slowed down. I mean, a 70% reduction in illegal migrants into the United States in 90 days. And we haven't even done anything. I mean, we've done things, but we haven't done the big things yet. But partnering with DOJ, we've made a difference, to say the least, on the southwest border. But this network is so well developed and is so efficient, it can move anything. It moves hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tons of illegal drugs into the United States every year. Until recently, tens of thousands of illegal immigrants, and that included special interest aliens, in unlimited numbers. But it could move other things too. You know, I was oftentimes in the last administration told that no terrorists, the cartels would not allow this incredible network, so efficient, so well developed, that the cartels would never let anyone in that was carrying, say, a pandemic type weapon, or biological weapon, or a dirty bomb or nuclear weapon, because it would be bad for business. And in a sense, they're right. But as I would always point out, there's a lot of subcontractors in this network. And these guys don't check passports. They don't do explosive residue testing. They don't look in anyone's bag to see if you got the money, you're in. And I said it a lot back then, and I'm trying to do something about it now, that when there is another terrorist attack in our country, if it comes from outside the country, up until 90 days ago, I would say that individual, as we would do the forensics on it, that individual or individuals get into the United States through the southwest border. I'm staying up late at night, every night, to try to prevent that from happening. But that's what keeps me up awake at night.
I mean, the reality is smuggling is smuggling is smuggling.
Right.
And the old joke was, if you want to smuggle in a tactical nuclear weapon, just wrap it in a bale of marijuana,
right.
Given some of our drug seizure challenges. So I think that that's a right issue. And increasingly, you're seeing cartels engage in terrorist tactics, and terrorists are obviously engaged in criminal operations. And on top of whatever else it is, it's a criminal operation. Anything from the counterterrorism environment that you think can be brought to bear? Because when you think of criminal enterprises, and I think you refer to them as dark networks, which they are, anything there to understand the business that you think we ought to be bringing to bear, and in the post 9/11 environment, so much in the terror finance, countering terrorism from a financial perspective. Is there anything unique there that can be brought to?
Yeah, you know, a few years ago when Bill McCraven, now retired, but not only a good friend of mine, but a phenomenal gunfighter and warrior, SEAL, he and I collaborated when he had Special Operations Command and I had the command of Miami on drilling down pretty hard on how the terrorists interact with criminal organizations. Once again, told repeatedly to let it go, that it was not a military issue, consequently don't get involved in it. But what we learned, and we're learning more and more and more, is a nexus, a touching between criminal networks and terrorist networks. We know, as an example, that the money laundering of massive amounts of profit from the U.S. drug demand there are terrorist organizations that make money from that money laundering process. We know, as an example, when cocaine moves into the Maghreb, the terrorist organizations, Boko Haram, that kind of thing, they allow it to pass through into Europe, and they just charge I mean, it's an incredibly lucrative way to raise money. They're not doing it in huge amounts yet, I don't believe, but to me it would be a next step. But so the nexus between criminal networks and terrorist networks is real, and I would predict will get more sophisticated.
And takes networks to defeat networks.
That's right,
So
sure
that's
does,
pulling all the pieces together there. Let's turn to the cyber sets of issues a little bit. So if when you start looking at the mass and vast responsibility to protect all of our critical infrastructures, if everything is critical, nothing is critical. So where would you see, and I'm not suggesting, I think DHS has designated 17 infrastructures to be critical, and they all are. But when you start looking at limited resources, unlimited risk, and a thinking enemy, where are you going to prioritize your resources there? And anything from where you see NPPD going, and obviously some of the good congressional activity there, whether it should be NPPD should be reauthorized in different kinds of ways. So,
well, I think, as you know, the department is tasked with protecting the .gov nets, and we do that. But you know, not perfectly, but we do that, and we of course spend a great deal of time, energy, and attention to that. And then the other aspect is to partner to the greatest degree possible with commercial concerns. I was just out in Seattle and met with the leadership of Microsoft. They're very, very interested in partnering as we are. It's something that certainly President Trump has taken on and is organized and is very, very involved in outreaching to, the government, God knows, can't do it by itself. In fact, probably could do it less capably if it didn't employ, or couldn't do it as well if it didn't have these partnerships with the commercial realm that I think should get better and better and better and better. But it's nonstop, relentless, and as I say, President Trump has taken that on and is organizing certainly some internal, a commission kind of thing to look at it. I am really, really impressed with the interest by the United States Congress. Congressman McCall from Texas, as an example, he and his staff extremely knowledgeable, very engaged, as is other aspects of the Congress. But I think it's a whole of government thing, and I think eventually, with the way the president is going, that it'll be a whole of government and a whole of the private realm as well. But as you say, Frank, you can't protect everything. Just before Jay left, he put the electoral system under critical infrastructure. That's controversial. I've tried to explain to people why he did it and what it really does mean. But it's another one of those. Hey, we're from the federal government. We're here to help. I generally, when I say that, by the way, most people head for the doors, and they should. But the reality is, we're from the federal government on this, and we're here to partner.
Any news on the executive order? Any idea when we can see that come out?
We're standing by with bated breath, rather. Can't wait.
And sort of another question along the lines of budget, and where I think you rightfully said the department is being tasked with more and more, and arguably getting fewer and fewer resources to be able to deliver on that vast mission. Yeah. Where do you see things standing there, and how do you see that playing out?
Well,
any concerns with where it?
Yeah, it's always concerns. You never have enough money. One of the things that Elaine is going to do is get into an efficiency thing. Of course, we have a EO to do that very thing and report out in 6 months. We're going to look at what Jay started, and I'll certainly continue on steroids, and that is a unity of effort within the department to streamline it, to see where we duplicate efforts, acquisition, whatever. It's amazing. The maze that is DHS in terms of different pay scales, acquisition processes. But anyways, Elaine, the number 2, is going to fix all of that in 6 months or less. but I think we have to, in the world we live in today, up until through the Cold War and up until fairly recently, I think there was always this defense and non-defense spending, and defense and non-defense professionals. I think the world we live in today, it really, the away game, Department of Defense, CIA, NSA, has got to meld with the home game, and that is DHS. So I think in terms of going forward, we have to think in terms of the security and non-security. and as opposed to simply defense and over there. Absolutely. Because, one of the things, we just had a great conference down at Special Operations Command last week, and Tony Thomas and I and others were there, and thinking in terms of as the caliphate is broken up, and we're having great success in Iraq and Syria doing just that, as that caliphate breaks up, the whole effort metastasizes more, decentralizes more, and our country, from a smaller point of view, but more from a domestic point of view, is at greater risk. So this idea that we think in terms of security and non-security as opposed to over there and back here. So I think we have to do that. And when we do that, I mean, you take like the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard today does a phenomenal number of missions. I mean, it is taking hundreds of tons of drugs out of the Caribbean flow and the Eastern, and it's wrapping itself around the Arctic, not to mention just saving boaters' lives off of Florida or up on the Great Lake. A phenomenal, but everything they do has to do with the security of our nation. And so to not look at them as part of the security equation makes no sense. So I would say that we should think in terms of security, not defense.
And the tyranny of time requires just maybe one or two last very quick questions. But you mentioned Syria. So in your role as Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, were you weighing in on some of the decisions, at least from what the implications could be to defend the homeland in terms of ramping up, which, quite honestly, we need to obviously accelerate the away game. But what sort of implications does that have from a Homeland Security perspective, yeah. and did you weigh in on some of the decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I was involved as a member of the cabinet and as a member of the national security as part of the cabinet. I was involved in all of the discussions in the Situation Room with the president and all sharing. I mean, he was, to say the least, I don't think he'd mind my saying this, he was very open to anyone at the table talking, giving their idea. Awesome. Clearly you had someone like Jim Mattis, Rex Tillerson, Joe Dunford, General Dunford, myself, and others. There was give and take, and he took all of that in and made, in my opinion, I don't think he'd mind my saying this, made exactly the right decision. The going forward from Syria, and who knows where that'll end, we had some opportunities in the past that we never seized, but going forward, the one thing that does concern me, and I know concerns our European friends and allies, is that as the caliphate goes away, and we're already seeing large numbers of the fighters go home because they're from Europe, they're passport holders, born and raised in most cases in Europe, and as they go into Europe, back into a continent that didn't know they'd left for 2 or 3 or 1 years to fight. Most of those countries, as I mentioned in my comments, are visa waiver countries. Yep. We have to start looking very hard at that program, not eliminating it and not doing anything excessive, but look very hard at that program and say, what do we need to do? Because the real intent in many cases is for these individuals to get to the United States. We are the Super Bowl in terms of terrorists, and that's what they want to do. That's where they want to come. Whether it's knocking down airplanes in flight, and I've taken some decisions about that we will likely expand. They want to get here. They want to do us harm. And that's my concern now that we're winning, if you will, in Iraq and soon to win in Syria, that those fighters go back to their homes in Europe and then very possibly make the trip to the United States.
Sobering, but I'm glad you're taking that foresight to the next level, because the returning foreign fighter issue is a vexing challenge, yep. including some of our visa waiver programs. I might also note that other foreign terrorist organizations potentially have been biding their time. Al-Qaeda has, they're down but not out, and the reality is a direct concern of the United States. Let me just ask the final question, and I mean, you've had a very distinguished military career in all sorts of roles and capacities. Everyone I've spoken to will tell me this is a soldier's general. So that means
Marine.
A lot. Not a general
Marine.
general. You're a Marine. Yeah.
With all due respect to the soldiers.
Marine. Sorry about that. But the reality is, everyone will tell you that you're thinking about the men and women on the very front lines, on the pointy end of the spear. I mean, now that you're at the Department of Homeland Security, they don't bode overly well in surveys in terms of morale. And I'm glad you mentioned the unity of effort on steroids, by the way, which I think it needs. Not an illegal steroid, but where do you see things going there? And now that you have an opportunity to speak to that, and I know you do every day, that workforce, but what should we be thinking, the rest of us as citizens, in terms of the men and women?
Well, I mean, you should think about the fact that we haven't had an airliner crash into a skyscraper in New York in quite a while. You should think in terms of we haven't had an airliner that has been hijacked. You should think in terms of the number of bad people that are illegal in our country that are either not here anymore or are hiding because ICE is after them and they're going to get them. You can think about the number of terrorists that don't get through the CVP checkpoints, whether they're the land checkpoints, sea, or air. You know, in 45 and a half years in the Marine Corps, it came to me that you can get human beings to do anything you want them to do. They will invade and take Iwo Jima, or they'll shine their shoes. You just have to teach them how to do it. You have to encourage them, you have to lead them, and you have to give them credit. The worst, I'm told, morale in the federal government is in this department. 90 days ago, I made a deal with the people in this department that I would protect them. I got their back, and I will encourage them to do their jobs, which they're doing each and every day. I suspect, not because of me, but because of the people they are, that their morale is already going in the right direction. Again, not because of Kelly, but because of what this administration has told them to do within the law. And they are really, really good people. They are remarkable in their dedication, and every American ought to be very, very, very happy that they have men and women like that fill out the ranks in DHS, looking out for them and their families.
General Kelly, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Thank you for your leadership, and please know you're calling on all of us in whatever role we can play to help. So thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Yep. Appreciate it. Hope that went well. Thank you.